Today's the 8th of August, which being divisible by 4 reminds me of the 4th of July, a great American holiday. So in honor of America, let's make a tier list for all the weapons in Orcs Must Die 3. I'm doing the base game weapons first, then I'll be covering the ones you get for beating the game. Starting off with a bang, we have the Alchemist Satchel. The Alchemist Satchel has two things going for it. One, it does in fact exist, and two, it's okay against weak clusters of the weakest weak enemies in this game. Now looking at what it has against it, it uses far too much mana for what you're getting, does little to no damage to enemies that are tall enough to ride the rides at Disney World, and even with every upgrade it didn't get any more useful. For all of these reasons, I am easily giving the Alchemist Satchel an F tier rating. Next we have the Arcane Staff, which is the best weapon you can get in the base game. The primary attack damage is fantastic and the secondary attack is great too. It's kinda like calling in an airstrike, danger close on your exact position. Continuing with the positives, you also get to apply the Arcane debuff, which makes enemies take 20% more elemental damage, presumably from your traps. The last pro here is that it upgrades quite well. You can upgrade the primary attack rate in either one of these, which do make a noticeable improvement. For the cons, the secondary ability does have a pretty short AoE. It's basically the small circle around your character. It's not awful, but fitting it into the flow of combat is much harder when you have to jump into an orc mosh pit to get the targeting right. But this can be fixed with the upgrade that I mentioned earlier. And the other con is that the rate of fire is pretty low on the primary attack. Again, this can be helped in the upgrade screen, and because of the already high damage, it doesn't matter much. Putting this into the tier list, I rank this weapon at an S tier. I wish I discovered this before I beat the game because it's my favorite weapon I've used from the base game pool. Next we have the Blade Staff, a traditional take on the lightsaber used by Darth Maul and the Academy Award-winning film Phantom Menace. Starting with the good, it does decent damage you come to expect from melee weapons, and the secondary ability is like a ground smash that bounces a group of enemies in the air so you can stop their movement and get in a couple free hits. This isn't bad for enemies from rats to large orcs, and it's a decent AoE ability which is pretty fun to watch. However, the flaws of this weapon are obvious when fighting enemies like ogres and higher. You'll get squashed a lot, and since the attack rate of this weapon is pretty low, you aren't doing much damage before you do. Ranking this weapon on the tier list, I give it a C tier. Now we have the Blunderbuss, which is a Chad version of the legendary Pirate's weapon. The Blunderbuss is a pretty good time in this game. The damage on the primary is great, you get a decent spread that can hit multiple enemies, and overall it's a reliable weapon that works on all enemies. This weapon really shines though when you upgrade it. If you reduce the reload speed all the way and add the freeze ability to the secondary, it completely reworks the gun and makes it 10 times more feasible. Now for the bad, this is the only weapon in the game that requires you to reload, and the base reload for this weapon is incredibly long. The rate of fire is also not fantastic, but understandably so since you only have 4 rounds. Finally, the secondary attack without upgrades does very little damage and uses far too much mana for what it does. Throwing this into the tier list, I'm still going to give it an A tier. Most of my issues with the Blunderbuss can be fixed by upgrading it, and although the base gun is more like a C tier, when you upgrade the reload and freeze, it's highly versatile and carried me through the entire campaign. Next, we have the Broadsword. Imagine the Excalibur, except when you use it, you die a lot. The one pro here is that the primary does do a good amount of damage per hit. However, the cons are that the attack rate is incredibly low and the secondary attack is wildly inconsistent. Half the time I feel like I'm missing my secondary attack when pointing it directly at them. Also, the AoE is not great in comparison to other melee weapons, and it doesn't shape up well against big enemies, meaning you'll die all the time using it. Even with the HP upgrade, you still won't gain enough health to counterbalance all the damage from the heaps of orcs that surround you. Plugging this into the tier list, I give it the E tier because it's slightly better than the Alchemist Satchel, and I just remembered that E was a letter. Next up, we have the Dwarven Warhammer, straight from the hands of the legendary warrior Eustace, who hails from the Nowhere region of Kansas. Contrary to the former on this list, the Warhammer does great damage and has a good AoE for both the primary and secondary. The secondary is the one where you spin like a Beyblade and launch groups of weak enemies into the air. Kinda like the Blade Staff, but it uses way less mana. And the secondary also allows you to sweep the leg on earth elementals, large orcs, and lower. A word of warning on the secondary, though I wouldn't recommend using it near the portal because you can launch small enemies into the rift very easily. Finally, the upgrades are useful. Getting lower mana cost and taking less damage while spinning does allow you to blend your enemies for an extended period of time. Now for the cons, it's still very much a melee weapon. The attack rate on the primary isn't great, and it doesn't work well on the big enemies like regular ogres and higher. Throwing this into the tier list, I'm giving it a B tier. I quite enjoyed spinning in circles and yelling "I'm getting me mallet" over and over again like an idiot. It also gets a bump in letter grade because unfortunately this is the best melee weapon in the game. Next up we have the Flame Bracers, but you want to brace yourself for how awful these are. The primary damage is decent on these, but considering it uses all of the mana, within 3 or 4 shots you'll be fresh out. I tried max upgrades and it didn't get much better either. Also, this is probably the worst secondary attack in the game. You would think with Flame Bracers you just have Doom Guy blast out of the wall and smack everybody into submission. However, you'll actually make a very slim fire line that sets a couple of people on fire. It doesn't last very long either. Ranking this on the tier list, I give it a D tier. For the mana, you're better off using a secondary on an actual weapon, but it has the unique perk over the Broadsword of keeping you alive. Moving into the next one, we have Ice Amulets. If you love Frozen and Elsa's your spirit animal, then this one is for you. But if you like doing damage, this is probably not for you. Putting all all that aside, the ice amulets do work fantastically with traps. You can freeze them in place and the saw blades will turn them into shredded ice. You can freeze a few of them with the primary attack or a cluster of them with the secondary attack. Now, the base ice amulets aren't great. You still use lots of mana, and they still don't have enough of a place in the lineup until you upgrade them. The first upgrade is to add more projectiles to your primary attack so you get more bang for your mana, and the other that I found incredibly useful is the aura ability that gives you a damage dealing freeze aura around you after using your secondary ability. It allows you to really become a functioning part of your trap hole, and with the wide AoE you can keep freezing and doing damage, which is fantastic. This was going to be a C tier initially, but after I upgraded it to max, this is going to be a B tier weapon. With the upgrades, it's well worth the mana, and I found it to be incredibly useful. Now we have the magic longbow to make you feel like Legolas. The magic longbow is a pretty well balanced weapon. You get good primary damage, a secondary attack that also has good damage, and overall this weapon has a good survival rate. The attack rate of this is also pretty fair, I feel. It's not crazy fast, but it's quick enough considering you're doing a good amount of damage per hit already. You can upgrade the attack rate, but it's not really noticeably game changing for the weapon. It still takes a while to take down big enemies with and without the upgrades, and it's not like the secondary attack is fantastic for taking out lots of grunts or taking out larger enemies for that matter. I have to use quite a bit of mana to take down enemies when using the secondary, and charging up the ability doesn't have enough of a payout either. With all this being said, I still think the magic longbow is an A tier weapon. It's good and I would rather use it than most other base game weapons. Now we move into the stone staff to make you feel like Gandalf the Grey, just to ram another Lord of the Rings reference into this video. Starting off, the obvious here is that the stone staff has a fantastic secondary attack. It's a Medusa effect of everyone in front of you turning to stone, and when you combine this with ceiling lasers or saw blades, its power is undeniable. Also known as immune to stone, whereas some people may be immune to freeze, which has the same effect. And finally, I've heard that the secondary can one-shot the flying boss in the max campaign as well as all the other flyers, which is pretty cool. However, the primary attack on this is absolutely horrendous. I mean, you'd have better luck throwing soggy tennis balls at them that does chiclets worth of damage for every hit, and you won't be one-shotting anybody with this primary. The fire rate is also pretty bad for how little damage you do. If you use this, you should use this like an amulet, only in combination with another weapon that does damage, and only pull this out to freeze people in traps. Plugging this into the tier list, I'm giving it a B tier. I don't like using it personally, and if you use tar and make a good enough kill box, I'd rather just bring the blunderbuss. Finally, for the regular game weapons, we have the wind belt. If you played any of these Star Wars games, you'll have a fantastic time with the wind belt. Now, this is a quality weapon right here. If you want mass crowd control on maps with lots of enemies that come in a single trap hole, there's no better choice than this. The wind belt allows you to reset all orcs back to the front of your trap hole, or if you want to speed things up, you can run into the front of your trap hole and push them into the lasers so they get immediately shredded. And if you're near a cliff, you can push a ton of them off of there too. Also, look at how much mana that uses. Not that much. The AoE on this is incredible, and it's some of the most fun that you can have. Not to mention the secondary ability that allows you to pick people up and run around with them. If you want to forcibly make a friend in Orcs Must Die 3, there's no better way. Or if you have an enemy you don't like, pick them up and cannonball off the map with them in hand. Also, if you have an orc about to make it to the promised land, you can body check them like Terry Tate and send them flying to the side to be dealt with in a moment. I would watch out when pushing them around the portal though, because I have accidentally launched an orc up one level into the rift. Now for some negatives, it's obviously not that good for large enemies. It kind of just gives them a strong breeze to cool them off. Also, it works great with traps, but standalone, the wind belt can't do much for you, unless of course you're near a cliff. And the upgrades aren't great either. I've tried the further launching upgrade, and when trying to push them off a cliff, sometimes you might end up launching them way too far over onto another part of the level. All in all, this is clearly an S tier weapon right here. The crowd control is unmatched, and the memery that you can do with it makes it probably the funnest weapon to use in the game. Moving on to the weapons you get from completing the campaign, we have the chain lightning staff to start. The primary attack on this is crazy good. You can one-shot every grunt, and taking down larger enemies is much easier and much faster than every other weapon. Also, the secondary is quite useful too. It's a lightning chain that strikes 2 or 3 enemies without upgrades, and that can come in handy for rats or clusters of weak enemies. And now I didn't realize it at first, but you can charge up the lightning chain to do more damage, which is cool too. Now the upgrades on this are okay. The secondary attack charge speed helps, and the secondary attack chains increase is good, but nothing is outstanding. Moving into the cons, the rate of fire is quite low, but this isn't much of an issue with the damage being so high. And the AoE on the secondary is just fine with max upgrades, but there are much better choices out there if you want to do more damage to groups of enemies. Putting this into the tier list, I'm giving it a solid A. The primary attack is amazing, but I wasn't blown away by the secondary enough to say it's worth the S tier. Next up, we have the crossbow. You can feel like Daryl, except instead of constantly grabbing bullets back, you can just hose them out of your crossbow without ever having to reload. It has an outstanding rate of fire, it's great for crowds of orcs, and the secondary ability is incredibly useful for stunning either large groups of orcs or stunning one big enemy. Now the spread will increase as you keep firing, but you can lower the effect of this by improving the accuracy in the upgrade screen. Speaking of upgrades, either of these are great, but I tried out the enemy stunned by secondary take increased damage one, and I was very happy with the results. The main drawback of the crossbow is the low primary damage. However, it's it's still not as low as the stone staff, and due to the incredibly high rate of fire, it balances out quite well. Plugging this into the tier list, I think this weapon is S tier. The crossbow does it all fantastically with a unique secondary that you'll find yourself using quite often. Next, we have the Elven short swords, which explain why Vorwick became evil and ultimately lost. These are pretty not great. The damage is okay, the attack rate is better than other melee weapons, but still okay, and I'll admit the secondary is kinda cool. It's a ranged projectile that can pierce through multiple orcs, and if you get them low enough, preferably with another weapon, you can line them up and hit a sick collat. The swords themselves do look pretty cool too. But now let's talk about the drawbacks. They don't upgrade great. None of the upgrades I used truly made the Elven short swords a much better weapon, and with the time to kill being so long, even on weaker enemies, you take much more damage than you deal. Plugging this into the tier list, I give it a low C. It's about on par with the blade staff and shares much the same issues, except it doesn't have as good AoE or damage. Finally, to end this video with a bang, we have the Scepter of Domination, which is a much cooler version of Loki's Scepter. If you spam click the primary attack, you pretty much have an endless supply of damage coming from your weapon at all times, and if you hold the primary, you can charge it up to launch an orb that explodes on impact and knocks orcs back. It's like a better version of the Blunderbuss ability, except it doesn't use any mana. The secondary ability is also the coolest / most useful in the game. You can take over the mind of any enemy and have them temporarily fight for you. Then if they die while under the mind control, they explode and knock everyone back once again. My favorite thing is to take over the minds of ogres, armored ogres, or other beefy enemies, gather them all up, then use the wind belt to yeet all the grunts off the edge. Also, you can very easily use this ability in combination with traps. Make an armored ogre your friend while in a trap hole, and for as long as they are alive, they will group up and distract all the other enemies, giving your traps more time to keep chipping away at them. One thing on this, if you take over a fire enemy that deals fire damage, then they try to damage other fire enemies with fire, it will do absolutely nothing. Finally, the mana use is pretty low, all things considered. You can probably get about 3 or 4 of them working for you at any time. Then if you get the longer duration perk to have your mind control last longer, you get the feeling that you can handle anything that comes your way. And for real this time, one final pro is that you apply arcane damage that applies that debuff to orcs that makes them take 20% more elemental damage. And for the cons, the primary damage is without a doubt lower than other weapons. However, with the fire rate being basically endless, it still makes the primary attack superior to most. Plugging this into the tier list, I'm going to give it a maximum grade of S tier. This is the best weapon in the game hands down. The primary is fantastic and the secondary is both unique and incredibly useful as well. Now that I know about this, I feel like I need to play endless to try to get as far as I possibly can. And we're fresh out of weapons to rank. Here's the final tier list for anyone that's curious. If you enjoyed the video, consider checking out one of these. And as always, thanks for watching.